How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Park Square podcast. Today I'm with Father John Whiteford, and we're going to be talking about uh, is mixing a sin? There was a recent Twitter kerfuffle where this was being hotly debated, and I thought Father John would be somebody interesting to speak to on this, to maybe illuminate the topic for us and kind of just talk about the Orthodox view. Father John, how are you doing?
Doing good. Good to be on
Uh,
your show. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Father, what prompted this topic? Could you just like give us an intro?
Well, on my wedding anniversary, which my wife and I have been married, I think, for 38 years, um, so it looks like it's going to work. But I get every time I post something about my anniversary, I get a certain number of idiots that will feel the need to say, "Hey, you married an Asian woman," and uh, and so I this last year I decided to act like, well, it took me a couple of years to figure out that she was Chinese. I had my suspicions, but um, but then I posted a follow-up point post in which I pointed out that this is something that happens every time, and I wonder what these people think they're going to accomplish because do they think I'm going to tell my wife, well, it's been 38 good years, but I'm finally figured out you were Chinese and we should never have been married. So I guess we're gonna have to call it quits. I mean, it's just stupid. And the thing about marrying someone of another ethnicity is, you know, I'm I wouldn't suggest that it's for everybody. And I've always been kind of an unusual person in the fact that I've always been interested in different cultures. And so whenever I meet someone from a different ethnicity, I'm very curious to find out about them and get to know them. And my wife, I met her in a high school gym class. It's not like I traveled the globe. When my wife and I went to Romania, we met a monk who asked, I introduced my wife to him, and he said, "Oh," and I told her, he asked where she was from, and I said she was from China. So you search very far for a wife. No, I met her in high school gym class. And people tend to marry people that they're around, and that's just a reality of human nature. And so you might complain about the immigration policy of this country. I think that that's a reasonable thing for people to be concerned about. People can disagree, but I think mass immigration is not a good thing for any country. But a certain amount of immigration is certainly not inconsistent with what we've seen over the last several thousand years of human history. But the reality is when you have people around each other, they're going to tend to marry. In the United States, even back when you go to the pre-United States period, the colonial period, there's been a lot of interracial marriage that's happened because people of different races were around each other. I'm the 12th great grandson of Chief Powhatan, who was, so that means that some of my lineage was here to greet the first English colonists when they arrived. How did I wind up having that as an ancestor? Well, back when the English first arrived, there were more men than there were women that came in the group that came here to settle Virginia, and some of those men decided that hooking up with good-looking Indian women wasn't such a bad option, so that happened. And the South is often tarred with this idea of being especially racist, which I don't think is really accurate. I think that most people, prior to very modern times, have tended to focus on their own ethnicity and think other ethnicities were somehow uh, lesser. But there's a lot of elite Virginian families that were very proud of their connection with the Powhatan Indians, especially Pocahontas, because she was very well known. And so, and there actually were, the Jim Crow laws that you had in the South only happened after the Civil War, and actually after the Civil War generation passed away, and then the next generation took over, and they decided the North has these kinds of laws, so let's adopt them because actually the Jim Crow law started in the North, not in the South, and they had very strict laws against interracial marriage in a lot of southern states. And they had laws that basically said that if you had one drop of black blood, that meant that you weren't white. But I know in Virginia they had an exception. It was called the Pocahontas exception, and that's because so many prominent Virginia families had Indian ancestry that they said, well, if you're less than a quarter Native American, we'll still call you white. But the one drop rule didn't apply in those cases. So that's just how human history has always worked. And I did a DNA test several years back, and I picked family tree DNA because I wanted to do a Y chromosome test, and I wanted to do a mitochondrial DNA test because your Y chromosome, only men have it, but it tells you about your direct paternal line. And it basically remains unchanged for thousands of years. So it gives you an idea about your deep family history along that particular line. And your mitochondrial DNA, everybody has that because mitochondrial DNA is what powers every cell in your body. And everybody gets that from their mother. So when you look at your mitochondrial DNA, you're looking at your maternal line back thousands of years. Well, the Whiteford family comes from Scotland, so I was expecting to get a Scottish Y chromosome finding, but it was Syrian. it, and
Wow.
actually, the first result, because I didn't pay for the full Y chromosome test, the first result put me in the same broad haplogroup as Albert Einstein and Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler actually had Jewish ancestry,
Oh,
which
wow.
might explain a few things. But so when I first got this result, I was thinking, do I have Jewish ancestry? Because there's no oral history in the family that would indicate this. But I paid for some additional testing to track it down. And actually, it's not a Jewish ancestry, but it is from North Africa because about one third of Jews have Y chromosome DNA that comes from North Africa ancestry, which the fact that they spent 400 years in Egypt would probably explain that. Well, turns out that the haplogroup that I belong to comes from Syria. There are Druze Muslims that have the same Y chromosome that I have. And you find this Y chromosome across Europe, although it's not a common one. But my family does come from Scotland along the paternal line. So I did some digging to try to figure out how could this have happened. And the answer I got back from some experts was probably Roman soldiers from Syria, or their explanation from this for the story, because right along the border of Scotland you had Hadrian's Wall, and then for about 100 years there was a wall north of that called the Antonine Wall, which happens to come very close to where the Whiteford family comes from. And so undoubtedly some Syrian soldier was, where that Y chromosome got injected, no pun intended, into the Scottish population. And I found there were a lot of Whitefords that actually had matches with me. So it's obviously not some more recent, um, DNA thing that might have been, the result of, say, an illegitimate child or an adopted child or something like that. And so people have been marrying across ethnic lines for a very long time. This is not something new. And my mitochondrial DNA, actually, I was expecting it to be Irish, and it turned out to be Viking. And the explanation I got back from that, and if it was a Y chromosome that was Viking, you could say, well, the Vikings were raping and pillaging their way across the coast of Europe, so that's probably how it got in the population. But mitochondrial DNA could only have come from a woman, and the explanation was probably from a Viking settlement along the coast of Ireland, because they had those about 1,000 years ago. So I think if most people did a DNA test like I did, you would probably find that there's a few things about your ancestry that you didn't know. And there's a few other things I discovered. Like I discovered I had less than 2% West Slavic. I usually always used to tell people I had no Slavic ancestry that I was aware of. And from genealogical records, I actually discovered that I'm a descendant of Saint Olga of Kiev and Saint Vladimir of Kiev. And because I'm a descendant from King James the Fourth of Scotland, King James the Sixth of Scotland, who was King James the First of England, was the one who authorized the King James Bible. He's a second cousin many times removed. But what happened was, according to this genealogy, is that basically, and descendants of Saint Vladimir married into the Polish aristocracy, and then eventually someone from that family married into German aristocracy, and then someone from that family married into Scottish aristocracy. And I descend, at least on my father's mother's line, from Southern American aristocracy, and so that's where that came from. But there's most people marry people who are around them, and so most people they primarily descend from the people that their ancestors lived around. But the United States, its history is a little bit different. We had a lot of waves of settlement, and while most of my ancestry comes from Scotland, I discovered that I had a little trace from Spain. I have French ancestry, German ancestry, but I knew nothing about West Slavic. But the fact that the genealogical records connected me with Saint Olga, and the fact that there's a little trace of Slavic DNA in the mix, I think probably confirms that genealogical record.
Yeah, absolutely. And the truth is for most of us in modernity, like the vast majority of us are the result of, a great number of sort of intermingling tribes and individuals in those tribes. And that's
Right.
sort of inescapable as a modern human being.
Right.
Where do you think this idea that race mixing is a sin comes from, specifically within, Christian like people? Where does that idea come from?
Well, I think a lot of people there's a natural cultural bias that encourages people to marry within their own kind. And so, particularly among Protestants, if you have some sort of an opinion, you go looking to the Bible to try to find some, verse that backs up your bias. And so people do that sort of thing. But, in the Bible, you find examples of people marrying across racial or ethnic lines with some frequency, and actually they get mentioned in the marriage service. The patriarch Joseph and Asenath. Asenath was the daughter of an Egyptian priest, and according to biblical records, would be a Hamite if you're talking about the descendants of Noah. And yet, the two half tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, are all descended from Joseph and his marriage with this woman. In the marriage service, we pray that each couple would be like Joseph and Asenath.
Hmm.
Well, if this was some sin that Joseph had committed, I don't think that we would mention that in the marriage service.
Right. Yeah. Well, and to me, what's beautiful about Orthodoxy, what's so appealing about it is this idea of the royal path. And
Right.
from my at least, diagnosis of what I see online, I think a lot of this might be a reaction to mass immigration. It's sort of humans are very we're dialectical creatures. We swing to these extremes. If mass immigration is being pushed at large in the culture or in your country, you're going to swing to the opposite extreme of no, we need absolute, racial purity or something like that. But can you talk a little bit about um, orthodoxy as the royal path, like what that means for us?
Well, it means that we don't go to extremes. I mean, the thing is most heresies fall on one side of an issue or another side of an issue, but there's the Orthodox view that's in between those two extremes. Like, for example, you could take the Nestorian heresy as being on one side of that path, and Monophysite heresy being on the other side of that path. But Chalcedonian Christianity is the royal path.
Mm.
And, I don't have a problem with people objecting to mass immigration because I think it's a volatile thing to have any society have a mass influx of people from some other culture. And in the United States, we've had a mass influx of many people from many cultures, and this creates problems. Now it presents opportunities. We get to evangelize people from all over the world now without having to leave our own country. And so that presents us with missionary opportunities. Maybe some of these people go back to their own country and be missionaries. But that doesn't mean we can't say, well, we don't think this is a good idea for our country. I don't. But, I'm glad my wife was able to immigrate. I'm not unhappy with my own decision. But when my wife and I first met in high school, and when we later got married, I wasn't thinking, hey, I'm going to make a point. I'm going to virtue signal. I'm going to one day be able to get on Twitter and say, I married an Asian woman. Twitter didn't exist. Mass immigration was not what it has become. And so I was just marrying a woman that I found attractive and got to know and found to be a good person. And being someone who was kind of nerdy and always interested in Asian culture anyway, I found her fascinating. And I was actually studying Japanese before I met her, how to write Japanese, but there were no Japanese people at Nimitz High School. But there were some Chinese people. My wife was one of them. And when I started talking to her, I was asking her questions about Japanese characters, and I thought, I'm really interested in the characters more than I am in Japanese grammar. And I don't have any Japanese people that I can talk to. Why not switch over to Chinese? So that's why I decided to start studying Chinese. But if you're a person who's not interested in that kind of stuff, if you don't like Chinese food, I would not recommend marrying a Chinese woman. That probably would not be a good mix for you. But for me, it worked. So the thing is, I'm against involuntary interracial marriage 100%. I think no one should be forced to marry someone that they don't want to marry. But I also think that if someone wants to marry someone else, as long as they're a Christian, an Orthodox Christian, if you're Orthodox, I don't see it as a problem. When I wasn't Orthodox when I married my wife, we got married at the Chinese Baptist church that she was going to. But I became Orthodox, and then she became Orthodox about 6 months later, and and I'm happy with that. I In the Orthodox Church, when we talk about a mixed marriage, we're talking about an Orthodox Christian marrying someone who's not Orthodox. That there is no canonical description or prohibition against marrying someone of a different ethnicity. And in America, most of us are a mix of different ethnicities. Now they might all be European, and so if you think about it in modern racial categories, where we talk about white people, you can say, "Well, I'm one race." That's not how ancient people thought about it.
Right.
Ancient Romans did not think of Germans as their white brother, and they thought of Germans as barbarians that they needed to, be prepared to defend their country against. So it's you're imposing modern sensibilities on the past when you think that somehow we make an exception for people marrying across ethnic boundaries as long as they had the same color of skin. That was not how anybody in the ancient world thought about it. And obviously, people noticed that people had different skin colors or different features that were related to their ethnicity. Um, but people didn't think about race like we do. They thought about ethnicity.
Right. And I wanted to, sort of ask you what is the, I guess, Orthodox view of race as a concept? Because to me, as we're kind of talking through this, as I was preparing for the episode, it seemed like this way that we think about race now is sort of more of a modern concept, and the equivalent view wasn't necessarily as present in antiquity, or at least not in the same way.
People thought about their ethnic group, and among Greeks that have come to America, there was a time when Greeks tried to get their kids to marry people from the same part of Greece that they were from because they didn't even want to have their kids marry someone from a different part of Greece.
Oh wow.
But as time went on, they started saying, okay, well, as long as it's a Greek, that's cool with me. But then gradually, a lot of Greeks started marrying people who were not Greek. And if you are a pious Greek, you would probably say, well, as long as they're Orthodox, I'm okay with that. But that's just how things tend to develop. But the idea of race, as we think of it today, did not exist in ancient times. Now, a lot of people will start getting up, getting their feathers all ruffled up about this because when you say that race is not a intrinsic thing, they'll say, "What do you mean? This is some sort of modernist critical race theory kind of thing." Well, actually, critical race theory people want race to be an integral part of one's identity.
Right.
So that's actually they go in the opposite direction. But it's just a reality that people didn't think about the white race or the black race or the Asian race. They didn't think about it that way. They recognize that black people look different. You find that in the Bible because you have a proverb that says, "Can an Ethiopian change his skin?" Well, obviously, they recognize that Ethiopians had different color than Hebrews did. But the same Old Testament also records Moses marrying an Ethiopian woman. So
Right.
you have an example in the Bible of a venerable prophet, the most, you could argue the most important prophet of the Old Testament, marrying a woman who was an Ethiopian.
I
And go ahead.
so sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Well, this is very clear in the Septuagint translation. Some people will quibble about the Hebrew word that lies behind that, which is Cushite. And they'll say, well, a Cushite is not a black person. Well, when you read that proverb where it says, "Can an Ethiopian change his skin?" If you read it in Hebrew, it's a Cushite that they're talking about there. So obviously they had a different skin color, no matter how you want to slice it. So you can't try to say, "Oh, we're talking about people of the same color." No, clearly not. Um, but the Septuagint translates this as Ethiopian. And if you look at the etymology of the Greek word for Ethiopian, it means like burnt faced. And so obviously when Greek people first encountered black people, they thought of them as being burnt faced because they're darker. And that's where the word came from. So they noticed this obvious racial distinction, as we would put it today. But nevertheless, Moses married one. And in not Saint, obviously, but Josephus's history of the uh, Jewish people, he elaborates on what we find in the book of Numbers, where it mentions Moses having married an Ethiopian woman, and it's in Numbers chapter 12, if I remember correctly, and his brother and his sister were complaining about his wife, who was an Ethiopian. So obviously they had some issues with this.
Hmm.
But according to Josephus, Moses met her. She was the princess Tharbus of Ethiopia. So we're not talking about Zipporah, who was the Midianite wife that he had after he left Egypt before he came back as the prophet. But Tharbus was a princess of Ethiopia, and when Moses was still functioning as an Egyptian prince, he led the Egyptian armies in a war against the Ethiopians and wound up establishing this relationship with this woman and married her before he went into exile from Egypt. And so when you see the movie The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston in it, and you see the early scenes of the movie where the Ethiopians are coming into the court of Pharaoh, and there's this princess who seems to be awfully friendly with Moses. This is sort of an allusion the movie is making to this tradition. And so the most likely explanation to how this all worked out is that when Moses went into exile, probably he wasn't able to take his wife with him. And so maybe she remained in Egypt. And it was only at the Exodus that she was able to leave Egypt with him. And so that's when they reconnected. But while he was in exile, he married Zipporah and had children with her. And so that's the most likely explanation of all these facts that I can give you. But when Moses' sister and brother were complaining about his Ethiopian wife, God didn't say, "Hey, Moses, shouldn't have married that black chick." It was actually his brother and his sister that got rebuked by God for complaining about him having married an Ethiopian woman.
Right. And so that was going to be sort of part of my follow-up is that it seems to me like as I'm reading the account, the biblical account of this, there's no condemnation on Moses for marrying somebody of a different tribe or race or
Right,
anything like that. If anything, there's a condemnation on Miriam and Aaron, specifically Miriam, for, taking umbrage with this, or at least not accepting Moses as wife, not yielding to Moses's authority
right,
in a way,
right.
or his judgment, or however you want to slice it. One sort of thing I could maybe hear from people who are critical of this view might be, well, polygamy is or polygyny is present among the patriarchs in the Old Testament, and this there's no clear condemnation of polygyny, but the church is against it. Why the condemnation on polygyny, but not on race mixing?
Well, you find many of the patriarchs having more than one wife, but I think that it's clear from the scriptures that having multiple wives was never seen as a good thing. It was always seen as being less than the ideal, but it wasn't prohibited in the Old Testament. Although by the end of the Old Testament period, it was very rare among Jews, actually. But it was certainly practiced in the patriarchal period. And when you're talking about the kings of Israel and Judah, we know that they had more than a few wives. Solomon had 400 wives and 600 concubines, so he had 1,000 wives in total. And obviously, that was not a good thing for him. It wound up causing him to have a spiritual fall, for which he repented according to tradition and according to the book of Ecclesiastes. But nevertheless, it obviously was not a good thing in his case. And even in the prophet King David's case, he had a number of wives that we read about in the accounts of his life. But because he had a number of wives, a lot of his family problems derive from that. Because for example, he had a one son who wound up raping his half sister. Well, it probably wouldn't have happened if he'd only had one wife and only had children from that one wife, but that's not how it actually went down. So, but the thing is, if you were going to argue, well, it was allowed in the Old Testament, but it's not allowed in the New Testament, well, you'd have to have something in the New Testament that said don't marry people of a different ethnicity, but there's nothing like that in the New Testament. St. Paul says when he's talking about remarriage, like if someone's wife or husband dies, that they can remarry, but only in the Lord. In other words, they can only marry someone who's a Christian. Doesn't say anything about their ethnicity, though. And we know that from the New Testament itself, and also from church history, there were a great many people who were Jewish and married someone who was of Gentile background or something like that. And it was never seen as a problem as long as they were both Christians. So and there in all the canons of the church, there's not one canon that says don't allow people to marry someone of a different ethnicity.
Mhm.
You're not allowed to marry a non-believer, but you are never prohibited from marrying someone who's a different skin color or a different ethnicity. And again, Americans are always, almost always, I should say, marrying someone of a different ethnicity because, you know, I'm at least something like 10 or 15 different ethnicities, depending on how far you want to go back and how far, what small percentages of an ethnicity you're willing to count. And I think most Americans whose families have been in this country for 100 years or more probably have similar histories. And so I could marry, if I could have married any white woman, and I would have been marrying someone that didn't have the same ethnic profile that I had,
Right.
unless I was marrying a cousin, which I wouldn't recommend. So that's just the reality of life in the United States. We are a country that had waves of people who've come from many different places, and there's always been people who've married across ethnic lines, including what we would call racial lines. And one thing I should say about the whole modern concept of race, it is an artificial construct, kind of like how we categorize tropical storms. Tropical storms have been going on for as long as the world has been around. So when we say the way we categorize hurricanes or tropical storms is an artificial construct, it doesn't mean that it's not based on something.
Right.
But there's nothing that says when the wind changes from 65 miles an hour to 66 miles an hour that it suddenly becomes something different. But
Right.
we categorize tropical storms differently based on how many miles per hour the wind is blowing. And, you know, if you have a category 5 hurricane, it's obviously going to be a different experience than a tropical storm or a tropical depression. So that's not talking about nothing. That's not a real thing. It's just that there's nothing in nature that says when the wind passes from 65 miles an hour to 66 miles per hour that now we're dealing with something different. That's just that is an artificial construct, but it's not disconnected from the reality. Just like the way we categorize colors. There are different cultures that have a different number of colors that they talk about. In Chinese culture, there are 5 colors. Well, we have a lot more colors than that in our culture. And some cultures have fewer than 5 colors. Well, it's just all a question of how you categorize them because you can kind of see how blue and purple can be lumped together. But it also makes sense to distinguish them. But how we decide to divide one color from another is us making a distinction that's not obvious from nature.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So in Father Seraphim Rose's or Saint Seraphim Rose's book, Genesis, Creation, and Early Man, he actually does talk at length about the question of the difference between what's called species and kind, and how those are referred to in Genesis. And it
Right.
talks about in Genesis, I'm paraphrasing here, but God created all of the different orders of creatures according to their species and all the species according to their kind, or vice versa. I forget how it's framed, but Father Seraphim Rose goes through the patristic consensus on this issue, and essentially it's that you have certain species, and that's connected to the essence. There's or the nature, right? We have a human nature, birds have a
Right.
bird nature, so on and so forth. And yet, certain characteristics, individual characteristics, can be missing from that bird or from that human nature, but it doesn't make it therefore a different nature. It doesn't transition it into another nature. A human cannot all of a sudden become a dog or become like this is
Right.
the modern evolutionary view that over time you can have like a number of characteristics that change until it eventually spills over into a different nature. That's not the
Right.
Orthodox view on essence. And so that for me was one of the easiest ways to understand kind of the Orthodox view of race. I've had a number of people ask me, friends and family who are not Orthodox, and when they hear that, like, I say, like, yeah, I believe in a creation, I don't believe in evolution, all these things. They ask, well, how do you understand, like, where do the different races come from? And it seems to me that Saint Seraphim Rose in the book sort of puts forth the idea that, in Adam, there's all these, there's like the fullness of man. But over time, due to the fall and due to things like genetic damage and loss of certain characteristics, you begin to see more pronounced, what appear to be differences in kind, but
Right.
not species. And so, which is again contrary to this evolutionary view that we gain genetic information over time that eventually spills over into a new species. No, quite to the contrary, it's that there's a loss of data over time that pronounces or causes these pronounced differences. But nevertheless, these species are remaining their same species. Anyways, I
Right.
always thought that was really interesting. And one thing too is that uh, the modern concepts of race, like you were talking, these distinctions that we make for the sake of, I would say, convenience or
Right.
just simplicity of speech. I've seen that applied to ancient peoples and ancient cultures and even religions in a way that is just so reductionist. Like, for example, I don't know if you've seen this meme. Somebody the other day, it was one of these like pagan, neo-pagan type of people on Twitter. They had posted a meme that was like, Abrahamism divides, but paganism unites. And it was like all of these different, you know, white races, like the Celts or the Germans or all the different white races. And it was all of their various pagan um, religions. And it was like they're united under this one banner. But Abrahamism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, I have a issue with the term Abrahamism to begin with, but um, that these religions divide, but paganism and this pagan view of race is what unites. And to me, that is totally not how that's actually played out throughout history.
Well, it's totally made up because it's not like when the Anglo-Saxons invaded into England that the Celts said, "Hey, our white brothers,
Right.
welcome."
Right.
They were, the Anglo-Saxons were killing off the male population of the Celtic people that lived in England when they arrived, and they later converted to Christianity, but they were pagans when they arrived. And so there's just no evidence from history that paganism has united anybody. Paganism unites maybe a tribe, um, but it's not united people across ethnic lines where they have different versions of paganism.
One thing you might find this funny or sad, depending on, I guess, how serious we want to treat the topic. But I was speaking to somebody the other day. We had just met. He was a Catholic, and he told me that his girlfriend was absolutely in no way even considering converting to Catholicism. That was not something she wanted to that she was okay with at all. And that I asked him. I said, "Well, you're Catholic, so how is that treated like within your parish or whatever?" Or with your priest, and he said that the way that they view it, and granted, he's sort of a like novice Ordo Catholic. He's not one of these like
Right.
hyper traditionalists or anything, but he said, "Oh well, I mean, it's seen as okay and fine as long as I commit to keeping my Catholic faith and try to raise my children Catholic," which to me just sort of goes to show that like in my opinion, the Orthodox view would be, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the only real wrong way to the only two races really are the Christian race and the non-Christian race. And that in
Right.
marriage, that's really the only mistake you can make in marrying someone is marrying someone who is not of the faith. Um,
Right.
do you mind kind of just expounding on that or maybe like elaborating on that a little bit?
Well, I don't know what the current state of Roman Catholic interpretation on this is. I think that they require a Catholic to marry someone who's at least a Trinitarian Christian.
Hmm.
And I also believe that if they're going to get married in the Catholic Church, that they have to agree to raise the children in the Catholic Church. I could be wrong about that, but I know in the Orthodox Church, that's the rule that we have. It is considered to be a pastoral exception. And when I was in Moldova for the first time, I was having a dinner with the uncle of Elena, who's from our parish, and he had a son who's preparing to become a priest, and he was when he was talking about modernism, he said basically that his idea of what modernism was the idea that an Orthodox Christian could marry someone who was not Orthodox. And my thought was, I'm glad that you live in such a pious Orthodox country. That's the worst example of modernism that you could think of. But what I tried to explain to him is look, you live in Moldova where like 5% of the people in the country are already Orthodox. So if you were going to marry a non-Orthodox woman, you'd have to really go looking for one. And so I could totally understand the Moldovan church saying, "Hey, you can't marry a non-Orthodox woman. There's plenty of Orthodox women for you to pick from. We're not gonna do a marriage if you're going to marry someone who's a Protestant or a Catholic." Um, but what I tried to explain to him was, well, look, you have to imagine what it's like in the United States. There are a lot of Orthodox Christians that go to school, and there's not another Orthodox Christian in their school. And then they go to college, and they don't know of another Orthodox Christian that goes to the college that they go to. And so for them to find an Orthodox wife, they really have to go hunting for one. And I would encourage them to make the effort, mind you. But I understand the pastoral economia that is behind the idea that, look, if you got a guy who's found a wife, wasn't able to find an Orthodox wife, but she's at least a Trinitarian Christian, and she's willing to agree to raise the children in the Orthodox Church. That's a non-negotiable minimum. Have to agree to raise the children in the church. That's something we're going to allow, because what would be the alternative? The alternative would be you'd have someone in that same situation, and you'd say, look, you didn't find an Orthodox woman. I know that there's no other Orthodox women in your parish that were eligible that you could have married, and there's no Orthodox people around you, but too bad for you. We're not going to allow you to get married in the church. Well, what would happen? Probably, unless you had an extremely pious person who was, willing to just remain celibate until they found an Orthodox wife, probably they'd wind up getting married outside of the church, maybe at the church of the wife or husband that this Orthodox person was going to marry. And then they might wind up getting sucked into that non-Orthodox church. And if you took a really hard line, you would say, well, look, you married someone outside the church, so you're excommunicated, perpetually. So now you're cutting them off from the sacraments. Someone like that's likely going to lose their connection with the church altogether. Whereas it's often the case that when we allow an Orthodox Christian to marry someone who's not Orthodox, that their spouse does come along eventually. I've seen that happen in many cases. This is not a guarantee. And when I've counseled people in this situation, I've always told them this can become a very divisive issue for you. So you really need to think long and hard about whether you're willing to deal with that. But that's a far more divisive issue than the person being a different ethnicity.
Right.
Because if you marry an Orthodox Christian, you might be white and your spouse might be black, Mexican, or Chinese. But if they're an Orthodox Christian, you already agree about the important stuff. You might have some cultural issues that you have to figure out how to navigate because you're coming from different backgrounds. So you're going to have different expectations. There could be misunderstandings. But if you both agree about the Orthodox faith, that's the biggest issue. But we allow, with the blessing of the bishop, we allow an Orthodox Christian to marry someone who's not Orthodox, might be the same, color and in every other respect. But that's a problem down the road if the other spouse doesn't come along. Which is why we require that person to agree to raise the children in the church, which is actually enforceable. If you get them to sign an agreement to that effect, if God forbid a couple gets divorced down the road, that's actually enforceable. You could present that to a divorce court, and most judges would say, okay, well, we're going to say that the children have to remain Orthodox because you agreed to this before you got married.
Mm.
So it is enforceable. But I always tell people, look, you might not care that your spouse is a different religion than you are right now. But when you start having kids, a lot of people rediscover their faith when they start having kids because suddenly you have this responsibility that you didn't have when you were a single person just looking for a hot person that you were attracted to. Now you have a responsibility for another human being, and you're thinking, what am I going to teach this child? And most people are going to start drawing on what they were taught when they were raised by their parents. And so, in a lot of cases, people who think that it's not going to be a problem start discovering that it's going to be a problem because they're wanting to raise their children the way they were raised, but their spouse was raised in a different faith. And so this can become a big problem. When I talk to couples like this, I mentioned this Irish ballad. There's an Irish ballad called The Orange and the Green. You can go to YouTube and type that in. The Orange and the Green Irish Ballad. And it's a ballad about a a person whose mother was an Irish Catholic and his father was a Northern Irish Ulster Protestant. And when they got married, they were both happy until he came along. And then the couple starts fighting about what's the identity of this child? Is he Irish Catholic or is he Ulster Orange?
Hmm.
And it's a funny song, but it's a reality. The song was talking about a real thing. This happened in Ireland, and it can certainly happen across different cultural barriers and religious barriers.
Y- Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you bring up such a good point, which I've found over the, last however many months of, putting out videos and just trying to get into these topics or talk about these topics with other people. There's this like modern misconception that religion is this thing that's sort of sequestered off in this little cubby or compartment of your life and that it doesn't affect everything else. Like, oh, you have your
Right.
religion and then you have the rest of your life. You have what you do on Sunday and then you have the rest of the week. And it's that's not at all close to how religion actually functions, or
Right.
especially how the Christian religion ought to function. It's an entire worldview. It affects every single aspect of how you live your life. And we're talking about mixed faith marriages. I was having a conversation with my wife just the other day. We had heard that a friend of ours was, planning to get married, and that the one of the people in the couple was not Christian. And not only were they not Christian, they were kind of an outspoken advocate of things that are like anti-Christian. Like, for example, I don't want to call anybody out, but it was like something like abortion or something like gay marriage or something like that. And um, anytime this had been brought up, it was sort of brushed off as like, oh, well, those are just political differences or they're this or that. And the one person was uh, wanting to, be a devout Christian and maybe even look into Orthodoxy. And my wife and I were just talking about the fact that this could become a problem later on down the line because, say, for example, there comes a question of the child, you know, or something like that, like that your child got pregnant as a teenager, God forbid, and they want to have an abortion, or your child comes to you one day and says, Mom, Dad, I think I'm gay. As parents, where do you go from there? Because the one parent thinks
Right.
at the core of their being, this is wrong. And I have to communicate that I think this is wrong, that this is, sin. Or the other parent is like, well, no, we're modern people, we're progressive in our thoughts. We don't want to be hateful or whatever. And it's just such a crazy misconception that people have that religion is this thing like divorced from the rest of your life.
Right.
Um, um,
Yeah, the
oh,
thing is,
sorry.
if marriage was just about who you can have sex with and it didn't involve children, well, you could have sex with lots of people,
Right.
conceivably, and maybe it would all be good. And not from a Christian moral perspective, mind
Right.
you, but I'm just saying you could have a relationship like that with people who had totally opposite views of you. But marriage is about making other human beings. It's
Right.
about starting a family. And you can't have that kind of relationship with someone who has a polar opposite view of you. Because once you have a kid, now you've got to raise that child one way or the other or some way different than both of you. But it can't be all of them
Right.
because you're raising a child one way. Children are, particularly when they're young, they're very black and white, and you can't You can't nuance things to children. It has to be you can't do this or you can do that.
Right.
Um, and you're going to just confuse a child to no end if you start saying, well, yeah, you could be a pagan or you could be a Christian. Well, no, you can't. Because if you're a Christian, you believe that that's the one true faith. And if you're a pagan, you don't believe that. Well, those two things can't exist in the same household with any kind of sanity. And so this is a problem that a lot of, like I said, we used to have parents much more involved in the decision making process for people getting married than we do today. Today, most people in our country figure, hey, it doesn't matter what my parents think, I'm going to do whatever I want. Well, when you're young and dumb, you sometimes make really bad decisions that when you get older and wiser, you start to realize, hey, that was dumb that I
Yeah.
did that. But you don't have the perspective to be able to see it, whereas other people can see it. And kids make all the difference in terms of what happens with a marriage.
And that's sort of where the rubber meets the road when you're in a culture like the American culture where it is historically Protestant, and then historically, an Enlightenment sort of it has an Enlightenment ethos. And a big thing with Protestantism, and I hear this all the time when I talk to people about, the Orthodox view around, say, infant baptism. Oh, well, why would you baptize infants? They haven't agreed that this is what they believe or that this is what they want to be a part of. And shouldn't you wait until they get older and can make a decision for themselves about, their faith or their profession of faith or what have you? And I grew up Baptist, and so I know when people say that, they might be well-meaning when they say that. They might have certain ideas about what it means for your children to be in a covenant, but like in the Orthodox view, it's the same as like in the Old Testament when it came to circumcising your child. It's like this child is by virtue of being in my household part of my covenant, to God. And to your point about modern marriage and if things were just as simple as a question of who you're having sex with, then things like values or your religion wouldn't be a question. The modern view of marriage, unfortunately, has kind of devolved to a point where you have people having sex for years before they're married, living together for years before they're married. And so ultimately, in the modern day, especially in America, marriage has devolved into this sort of thing where it's like, okay, we've been shacking up together for years. Let's go ahead and get legal with this, or get some paper behind it. And there's not this understanding of marriage as like a sacrament.
Right. It's an unfortunate development in the culture because when I was growing up, people didn't think that way. I mean, there were obviously some people who were living together and stuff like that, and certainly people had marriage outside of wedlock. I mean, they had sex outside of wedlock. But the idea that marriage was not where you wanted to end up with was not something most people would have contemplated. But we've somewhere crossed the line. I was a child support officer for the state of Texas for about 13 years. And that's where I first started to see this kind of an attitude because I would be dealing with people who had two kids with each other already. And I understood family law because that was my job. And the reality of it is, you are already on the hook legally when you have a child with somebody else. Being married to someone else is actually not a huge legal commitment unless you have a lot of property. Obviously, that becomes an issue if you have lots of property to split. But for most, you know, people of moderate means that don't own tons of stuff, the real issue is when you have a kid, you are now responsible to support that child until that child's 18 and out of high school at least. And if a child's disabled, you might be on the hook for that child for the rest of the child's life. And so I would see people who had two kids already with someone that they were not married to. And it used to be the case in Harris County, Texas, that if you were living with someone, like let's say, baby daddy has a couple kids with this woman and mom, because they separates, opens up a child support case on them. because he left or whatever. But then let's say they come back together and they would come into my office and they'd say, "Hey, I want to stop the child support." Well, it used to be the case in Harris County that the judges would say, "Well, look, you want to stop the child support? Go get married. Otherwise, we're going to keep the child support going. If you're together, you pay the child support, it's coming right back into the household." So it's, if you're both together, it's not a problem that it's coming out of your checks. It's coming right back into the family. Because judges didn't want to keep modifying cases where a guy was in the house, out of the house, in the house, out of the house.
Mm.
And I would tell people this who would come into my office, and they would say, "Oh, we're not ready for that." Like, "Oh, getting married was some huge commitment." And I would try to explain, "Look, you are already on the hook for two kids
Right.
until they are 18 out of high school. That's 25% of your net income
Right.
for all of those years, not to mention if you get behind interest that might accrue on back child support." And so, why do you think getting married is some big commitment? But that's how people think these days. And it's really it's kind of a combination of debasing marriage, which partly when they made gay marriage a thing, I think that really debased what marriage even means. But it was already being debased before that happened. You combine that debasing of marriage with maybe children growing up in homes where they see their parents getting divorced and this being a big legal thing, and them thinking, "Oh, I don't ever want to get into that situation." Because that was really a big problem for my parents when they got divorced. And so they think, "Oh, getting married is some bridge too far, but having a bunch of kids
Right.
outside of marriage is not." Well, it's actually that's not how it actually works legally. But most people don't know this. When I was doing child support, I often thought that the state of Texas and really every state would be well advised to have someone who was doing something like what I did come into a middle school class and spend a couple of days explaining family law to people, because a lot of these young kids, they don't know the ramifications of their choices until it's already too late.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
once had a guy that I was dealing with, and he was like 19 years old, and this guy had already knocked up like five different women and had a kid with each one of them. And probably when he was in high school, he was the stud on the campus. "Oh, I got five baby mamas. Ooh, look at me. I'm big, handsome, and irresistible." The guy had already destroyed his life, because when you add up the child support obligations for each one of those five kids, he if we can only garnish half of somebody's check for child support, but it doesn't mean you don't owe anything beyond half of that.
Right.
And I've had many cases where a guy had so many different kids with so many different women that they owed well over 100% of their net income in child support. And nobody makes more than 100% of what they make.
Right.
So you will you a guy like that is destined to end up in debt for the rest of their life, have their credit totally destroyed, and never see the end of that.
Right.
But a guy in high school doesn't know that. He's just
Right.
knocking up hot women that he knows on campus and thinking he's a stud.
Right.
And I really wish that someone would try to explain it to these guys before they made all these dumb mistakes. That, hey, don't ruin your life. Don't do these dumb things, because these are the results. Because I would deal with guys that were like, on Social Security for age, who had back child support cases that they were never going to pay off, and we were garnishing half of their Social Security check, and they were already getting a small Social Security check, and they'd come into my office and say, "How am I supposed to live on half of this check?" And I'd say, "You know what? I'm sorry, but you made a lot of bad decisions in the past, and you're kind of stuck. There's nothing I can do for you." And unless you can sweet talk these women into forgiving all that back child support, you are going to owe it till the day you die. And if you have any assets, they're going to try to take it from that too.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, a lot of people, online will talk about the horrors of child support and all of that, all of that that's involved. And I mean, I feel for them. That's a really awful situation. And unfortunately, like you're saying, like, we don't live in a culture that really pushes a Christian marriage ethic, a Christian sexual
Right.
ethic, and these sorts of things. And I think a lot of people do get duped into this sort of American dream that sets you up for failure ultimately. Um,
Right. And the thing is, I
um,
can understand like the manosphere complaining about child support
sure,
laws
sure,
because they certainly historically have favored the women more than the men. But the thing is, there are men who are getting child support from women. So it does happen.
right,
I found that the men who were getting child support were the worst child support recipients to deal with because they were always saying, if I was a woman, blah, 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 blah. And the women who were paying child support were the worst obligees that I had to deal with because they felt like, well, I gave birth to those children, so I shouldn't have to pay anything. He ought to be paying me because I gave birth to those children. Well, no, ma'am, he's taking care of the children you gave birth to. You have to pay him because those children are due your support. So the thing is, does anybody think you should be able to have children and then walk away from that and not be obligated to support them in some way? How could that possibly be a moral thing in any universe?
right.
So the idea that there are child support laws that require parents that are not in the home paying the bills and taking care of their kids, everyone ought to understand that. And maybe you might argue that this or that law is unfair and maybe it needs to be changed. But it's always going to be the case that society is going to say that if you make a baby and you're not totally disabled and unable to support that child, there's some kind of way you need to support that child. That's always going to be a thing, and it should be.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, And so, we started off this episode talking about the question of race mixing and, the royal path of Orthodoxy. And I think ultimately, where we ended up, I think is a very interesting place to be.
Yeah,
I'm always interested in the question of marriage and, modern culture and all that.
right.
So kind of bringing
Marry
it
a
back.
Christian woman who shares your faith and is committed to marriage, and you won't ever have to pay child support.
What's funny is, whenever I was dating, like I got really serious and I met my wife on a dating app, of all places. And when I hunkered down and I was like, okay, I need to get serious about finding like a wife. I started filtering very hard in the messaging of the dating app because I had gone on dates, sometimes get to the second date with a girl and realize she's an atheist. She doesn't even believe in God or something like that. And I started realizing I got to get really serious about figuring out where these girls stand before I even, go on a first date or anything like that. And so the first question I asked my wife whenever me and her matched on the dating app was, "Do you read the Bible?" And she said yes, obviously. And it's been, great since then. And she's a
Right,
lovely Christian woman. And it has saved us. I mean, we have our fights, but it has saved us so much headache just being on the same page about things. Because,
right,
when
right.
Christ is like the head. Um, so on the back to the question of, race mixing and marriage and that sort of thing. Whenever I was researching for this episode, the term ethnophiletism came up. And I don't know if
Right.
this assertion that race mixing is a sin, if that would be classified as ethnophiletism. But can you talk to us about what ethnophiletism is and the Orthodox view around it, and if it relates to this discussion?
Well, the ethnophilitism uh, term, as far as I know, originates from the 1872 Council of Constantinople, which condemned it. And I used to assume that the things I read online about this were correct, so I thought that council condemned racism. It actually did not condemn racism because they weren't thinking in those categories in 1872. Uh, Basically, the issue was under the Turks, Constantinople, the Patriarch of Constantinople was made the head of the Rum Millet, which meant that he was the person that was in charge of all the Orthodox Christians that were under the Turks. Well, the Turks captured a number of Christian kingdoms, including Bulgaria. And Bulgarians speak a very different language than the Greeks, but they don't look a lot different than Greeks. They're white. Greeks are white. Um, but they speak a very different language. Bulgarian is a Slavic language. Greek is Hellenic language, I guess. I'm not sure if it has any other categories that you put it into. Well, Bulgaria was a separate patriarchate prior to the Turks conquering Bulgaria. But when the Turks conquered it, they were all placed under Constantinople. And Constantinople was in the habit of putting Greek bishops primarily over these Bulgarian dioceses. And the Bulgarians resented this because they wanted bishops that spoke their language, that served in their language, which they were used to doing Slavonic in their services. And Slavonic is a church, it's in the religious register of Slavic languages. It's not the way people speak in common day speech, but actually Bulgarian is about as close to Church Slavonic as any Slavic language is, because St. Cyril and Methodius understood Bulgarian, and that's how they were able to start translating things into Slavic. Well, this controversy escalated. You had Bulgarians that were petitioning the Turkish Sultan to change things because they were unhappy with how the Patriarch of Constantinople was managing affairs. The Sultan was trying to accommodate these people, but there was a lot of back and forth. And ultimately, the Sultan agreed to allow them to establish an exarchate, but Constantinople didn't like the idea. So the Bulgarians went ahead and established their own exarchate. So the idea was it was going to be like an autonomous church of Constantinople. It wasn't going to be totally independent. They would still get their chrism from Constantinople. Big issues could still be appealed to Constantinople. But otherwise, the normal day-to-day affairs of the Bulgarian church would be handled by Bulgarians. Constantinople was not happy with this. And the Bulgarians did cross some lines because actually you had Bulgarian bishops that were doing services in Constantinople itself, which clearly was within, if anything is in the diocese of Constantinople, Constantinople would be it. So they held this council and they condemned ethnophilitism, and they said the church doesn't organize itself based on ethnicity. And so we condemn this idea the church has to be divided along ethnic lines. Well, the thing is, there's a certain amount of truth in that, and there's a certain amount of dishonesty in that. Because, like, for example, if you take our parish has a lot of ethnicities in it. So it would be wrong if somebody said, hey, we want to establish the Hispanic parish without working with the priest and the bishop to try to do that, because I'm actually not opposed to doing that, actually. But if somebody was just dividing the parish because they were saying, hey, that priest is a gringo and we want to have our own parish, so we're going to go do our own thing and not have a blessing to do it, well, that would be a schismatic way of dealing with a issue that has some legitimacy. Because if people are speaking Spanish at home, I can understand why they want to pray in Spanish. There's nothing wrong with that. Sure. But you can't just, insert, your own wishes and then disregard ecclesiastical authority entirely. And so anyway, this council condemned ethnophilitism. The Russian church actually served to try to mediate this schism, and it actually lasted for a very long time. But you know what? The Bulgarian church is an autocephalous church today with their own patriarch. So they never conceded to Constantinople's demand that they submit and have Greek bishops run the show. And the irony of it is, if you want to talk about ethnophilitism, the Greeks are probably the worst offenders if you want to talk about different ethnic groups in the Orthodox Church that push their ethnicity as the primary thing. Because the Greeks often talk about the importance of Hellenism, not Orthodoxy, but Hellenism. Well, I can understand if I was a Greek, I would be proud of my Greek heritage.
Sure.
Greeks have a wonderful culture. The traditions of the Greek church are very beautiful and ancient. They go back to the time of the apostles. Nothing wrong with any of that. But the thing is, as beautiful as all that is, the Orthodox faith is one rung higher than that. And so I'm never going to agree that it's important to push Hellenism on people that are not Greek.
Yeah.
We want people to become Orthodox. We don't want to make the Mexicans in Houston become Greeks or Hellenophiles. That's not what Orthodoxy is about. And so the whole issue of ethnophilitism is a little bit more complicated than a lot of people understand it to be. And a lot of the church never recognized that council as being a pan-Orthodox synod. And so I think that, like I said, there's things that they said that were certainly true. If you divided the church, like for example, um, if you were trying to establish some new church inside of Russia, because hey, we are Kazakhs that live in Russia and we want to have our own church. Well, that would not be the way to go about it. You might have a legitimate issue that, hey, I'm a Kazakh and I speak this different language than the Russians. We want to have churches in our own language. There's a proper way to deal with that. And the Russian church actually serves in something like a couple dozen languages inside of Russia. So the Russian church has never been opposed to accommodating people in terms of their language or their culture. Um, but if it did, I would say it would be wrong because if you have some area of Russia where they speak a totally different language and you're trying to make them speak Russian and do the services in Slavonic, I would say that's not an Orthodox Christian way of dealing with this because we want people to be saved. We want people to be members of the church. We're not trying to convert people to our ethnicities.
Yeah,
So that's where I would say that would be wrong.
yeah, absolutely. There's a really funny story. Whenever I was inquiring into Orthodoxy, I remember I was doing some video work with a guy out of Austin, and he was a Catholic. He's Roman Catholic. And he was like, "Why are you still Protestant? Why don't you become Catholic?" And I was like, "Well, I'm kind of looking into Orthodoxy." And he said, "Orthodoxy, aren't they like super ethnic or something?" And that's something I hear a lot from people. They always say, aren't Orthodox super ethnic? Because, you hear the name Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox. But these are people that are not very familiar with the parishes at the ground level. Because I mean, our parish is very, I mean, I would say there's a lot of Russian elements. There's a lot of American elements. It's a homey parish. It wasn't
Right.
alienating at all. But it was funny because he said, isn't that, super ethnic, blah, blah, blah. And that was one of his objections to Orthodoxy. But he said, you should become Catholic because you're a Western man. And, because you're a Western man, you should become Catholic. And I just thought it was ironic that his objection to Orthodoxy was its seeming, ethnocentric, nature, but I ought to convert to Roman Catholicism because I'm a quote unquote Western man. It's just sort of a little bit of doublethink going on, but
Well, the interesting thing is in the Roman Catholic Church in its history in the United States, there were Irish Catholic parishes, there were Polish Catholic parishes, there were Italian Catholic parishes, there were French Catholic parishes, and German Catholic parishes for that matter. And the thing is, a lot of these people kept their distance from other ethnicities for a very long time. But eventually, you started having Irish people marrying Italians because the same thing happened with them that happened to the Greeks that wanted their children to marry someone from the same part of Greece that they were from. Well, in the United States, the reality is the chances that your child is going to marry someone from the same village that your family came from is probably pretty small. And so eventually Catholics started thinking, hey, I guess as long as they're Catholic, it's okay. But there was still some resistance to it, mind you. But I've known people who are like half Italian and half Irish, and they tend to identify with one or the other or both. But it was not. It was there was a time when that was kind of against the grain kind of thing, even in the Catholic community. Whereas today, no one would bat an eye about it because they just say, "Well, you're Catholic, marry each other."
right.
Um, but so the same thing has gone on in Orthodoxy. There was a time when if you were an Arab and you were Orthodox, your family would probably object if you wanted to marry a Greek, if you wanted to marry a Russian. Now, I think most people are past that, but you still have some that are resistant to that. Well, the thing of it is, I think people can marry whoever they want. And if I was redheaded and green eyed and I wanted to marry a wife who was going to be redheaded and green eyes, so that I could have redheaded and green eyed children, I'm free to do that.
Right.
I would personally say that that's probably not the most important criteria, but I can't say that you can't make that choice. We all have our preferences, and if that's who you want to marry, you find someone that meets those descriptions, great. But the thing is, if you go turn to somebody else who marries someone who chooses not to marry a redheaded, green-eyed woman, you should not say there's somehow a violation of the Christian tradition, because it's not. If it was, I would be happy to say so, because I believe that whatever the church teaches, we should follow. But the reality of it is that's not what the church has ever taught. So you can't make things up because you wish it was so.
Right. Absolutely. And so we started off this episode, and you made a comment about how something to the effect of like having to divorce your wife or something because you found out she's
Right.
Chinese or something. What's interesting is that, uh, there was an Old Testament passage I came across recently that I could see people maybe trying to make it a counter argument with, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this. I have a feeling I know how you'll respond, but I think it's worth bringing up at least. So
Right.
in Ezra and Nehemiah, there's this command given by Ezra and Nehemiah to put away foreign wives. How are we to understand this?
Well, one key thing to consider in that is if you transport the ethnic differences between Jews returning from the exile and say people from Canaanite or Philistine or non-Jewish Middle Eastern backgrounds, their ethnic differences in terms of like how they would appear, their external features would not have been noticeable. So it would be like, if you're going to say it was the ethnic things that were the issue there, then that would mean that you can't have Irish people marrying Italians, because that's mixing ethnicities, and God established the nations, and if God wanted Irish people to be Italian, he would have made them Italians to start with. But the thing is, we don't view it that way. So I never hear people online saying to people who were Irish and married an Italian, "Oh, you traitor to your ethnicity! How dare you marry this, Italian woman or whatever." You never hear that, because they're only thinking about it in terms of a modern category of white, which is not how people thought of their ethnicities in ancient times or in the Bible. They didn't think of it that way. So the Jews that Ezra and Nehemiah were talking to were married to women who would not have been obviously different in terms of their phenotypes or how they looked or anything like that. Uh, but what was the difference? The difference was their religion. That was the problem. Because we have examples of people in the Old Testament who married women who were actually of different groups, and they're in the genealogy of Christ. We have Rahab the harlot, who was a Canaanite, one of Christ's ancestors. We have Ruth the Moabite, uh, one of Christ's ancestors. So nowhere, like when you read the book of Ruth, there's no hint at any point that Boaz was somehow crossing the line of the law by marrying a Moabite,
Mhm.
because she embraced the Israelite faith before they got married. She said to her mother-in-law, who was, she was married to one of Naomi's sons, while they were in Moab, because there was a famine in the land. And she said, "Your God will be my God, and your people will be my people." So she basically she converted,
Right.
And so Boaz thought of her as a righteous woman. And the whole book of Ruth is about how he winds up marrying her. And this is a beautiful story. And there's not one single scintilla of a hint that anyone would have said, "Oh, what are you thinking, Boaz? You can't marry a Moabite. The law forbids it." No, there was no such suggestion.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, honestly, like anyone who reads, the scriptures could come away with that. There's so many examples of that, like there are so many things that the scriptures are explicit about this is not approved. You do not need to do this. This is sin, etc. We never get that with this
Right.
topic. Um,
And it
so
seems like it would have been an issue that would have come up at some point because St. Paul certainly does deal with marriage. And he talks about
absolutely.
who you can marry and who you can't marry. And he doesn't say you can't marry someone who's of a different ethnicity or of a different color or anything like that. It's all about the faith.
Right.
That's the
Yeah,
only thing St. Paul's concerned about. That's the only criteria that he gives.
right. Um, yeah. And so last thing, Father, is just if someone only were to remember maybe one idea from the episode, what would you want it to be? I guess what are your closing thoughts on the topic?
I think the key thing is that I'm not trying to talk people into getting married to someone of a different ethnicity, particularly someone of a different race, as we would categorize it in modern times. I do think that if you're an American and you marry a Chinese woman who's from China, that does pose some problems for your relationship. They're not insurmountable, as I've proven in my own marriage. But the thing is, like I said, if you don't like Chinese food, if you're not interested in different cultures, if you are irritated when you hear people speaking a different language other than English, you probably shouldn't marry someone who speaks a different language and is Chinese. Um, but the thing is, you can marry whoever you want, but just don't try to impose your own personal preferences on someone else who's married someone else within the faith, because the faith is the only criteria that the church holds. It's the only criteria that the Bible holds out as a standard. And you know, every marriage is a question of how compatible are these people. And when I before I got married to my wife, the Baptist church that we got married in, they required marriage counseling, but I was going to college, studying to be a minister, and so I wasn't able to do the marriage counseling to the same degree they normally would have required. But they required we take a personality test and we do one marriage counseling session before they would allow us to get married in their church. And I learned a lot from both of those things. And I remember when they did the personality test, the guy was saying, like your families are very similar in some respects. Your families are very close knit. You value family a lot. However, she comes from a family where everything's done a particular way, and you come from a family where it doesn't really matter that much. And you're going to have problems in this area. So you're going to have to learn how to navigate because there's a way she did things in her house, and there's a way things you did in your house. But you're going to have to figure out how are we going to do it in our house. And that was very prophetic because, in my family, for example, if you hung up the toilet roll on the roller, you were going above and beyond the call of duty. Didn't matter whether it was facing one way or the other. But in my wife's family, it was supposed to be coming up over the top. If you hung it up where it was coming out from underneath, that was not the right way, and it needed to be fixed. Well, we had more than a few arguments in the early years of our marriage over things like this. Eventually, we figured out how not to irritate each other any more than necessary, and we got past it. But it took a while. And, the thing is, had I not already been interested in Asian cultures and studied a lot of Chinese history, studied Chinese philosophy, there's a lot of things about my wife that I might not have understood, and it would have been a bigger problem for other people than it was for me. But it wasn't for me. And I like Chinese food, as a matter of fact. I worked in a Chinese restaurant because my future in-laws helped me get the job while I was home for summer the first 2 years I was in college. And I was a waiter the second year. And every time people would come in to the restaurant, almost they would say, "Hey, you're not Chinese," and I started telling people I'm adopted, and do it with a straight face, and they say, "Oh," but it's not. I wouldn't recommend it for everybody, but I found a wonderful wife. I think I could have done a lot worse. I wouldn't go back and change anything, but if you are not inclined for to be interested in other cultures, you don't like hearing people speak different languages, you don't want to figure out other ways that people live and think, maybe that's not a good idea for you, but it's not something the church forbids. It might not be wise for you. That's the way to look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, thank you, Father, for coming on and talking with us. And guys, Father John has a really great blog. Father John, you want to plug that?
Yeah, it's blogspot dot father spelled out john.com. And that's the blog. And also our parish website is saint spelled out jonah.org. And that has links to my blog and the articles section, as well as to direct links to several articles I've written over the years.
Awesome. All right. Well, Father, thank you for coming on. And guys, let us know what you thought about this down below. And I will see you later. All right. Let me end this recording.